At 11:05 on the 14th of July, 2026, Cuba did not slowly lose electricity. It went dark almost at once, the third nationwide grid collapse in just over a week. Fans stopped turning in apartments, refrigerators fell silent, traffic lights went dark, water pumps paused in the middle of a working day. Cuba's state utility, UNE, said a problem at Unit 1 of the Felton Thermoelectric Plant in Holguin triggered a sudden frequency change, after which the national electric system disconnected. The national grid serving nearly 10 million people had gone down, even though some generators and isolated backup systems remained online. This was not a hurricane passing over the country. It was not an airstrike, and it was not a damaged cable serving one neighborhood. The first collapse had arrived on the 6th of July. Another followed on the 10th of July. 4 days later, the system failed again during Cuba's repeated outages. Havana residents have moved toward balconies, parks, and the Malecan to escape heat trapped inside apartments, or to search for a mobile signal. The familiar image of Cuba, music, old cars, bright hotels, and streets full of life had been replaced by the sound of generators and the glow of rechargeable lamps. How did a Caribbean island with so much sunlight become unable to protect its nights? But in Cuba, darkness never remains only darkness. A refrigerator becomes a countdown to spoiled food that may have taken days to find, an electric pump can no longer lift water into a rooftop tank, an elevator stops serving an elderly resident on the 10th floor. A hospital may be connected to a protected circuit, but its backup generator still needs diesel buses. Pharmacies, bakeries, phone towers, schools, cold storage, and sewage systems all depend on energy. When the grid disappears, the modern country built on top of it begins to disappear as well. By the next morning, the national system had been reconnected. That sounds like the end of the story, but it was not the return of normal electricity. Reconnecting the grid only meant that Cuba's regions were synchronized. Again, it did not mean that the country suddenly had enough working power plants or enough fuel. 2 days later, EFE, citing UNE's daily forecast, reported that as much as 72% of national electricity demand was expected to go unmet during the evening peak. The island was no longer completely black, but millions of people were still living by the timetable of the next cut-wone energy world belongs to those who can build a private island of power. A household receiving money from relatives abroad may buy an inverter, a battery, or solar panels priced in foreign currency. A restaurant may invest thousands of dollars to protect refrigeration and remain open. Some hotels and larger businesses can operate generators or install private backup systems. Another world belongs to families paid in pesos who cannot buy their way around the public grid. At night, inequality becomes visible as a pattern of isolated light surrounded by darkness. This is the central contradiction of Cuba's energy crisis. The country has achieved near universal connection to the electricity grid. It has strong sunlight, a long engineering tradition, domestic oil and gas, and a rapidly expanding collection of solar farms, yet its power system now survives without a meaningful reserve. On an ordinary day, operators deliberately disconnect neighborhoods because generation is far below demand. On a bad day, one failure can push the entire network out of balance. Cuba does not face one kind of blackout. It faces a shortage every day and the possibility of collapse behind it. The simplest answers are also the most politically useful. The Cuban government points to the United States and an intensifying campaign against fuel shipments. Washington points to communist rule, failed economic policy, and decades of neglect. Each explanation contains part of the truth, and neither is large enough by itself. The present crisis was built from aging machines, shrinking support from allies, scarce foreign currency, delayed investment, natural disasters, external pressure, and a state that often relied on patchwork repairs while large-scale replacement lagged. To understand why one failed unit can darken an entire country, begin with the map. Cuba stretches more than 1,200 kilometers from west to east. It is long, narrow, and electrically isolated from its neighbors. A connected national grid allows power generated in one province to support another, but there is no large foreign network beyond the coast ready to rescue it. Stability has to be created inside the island. When supply becomes too weak, trouble in one region can travel along the same system that was designed to share electricity. There are also two different meanings behind the word blackout. The first is controlled load shedding. When demand is greater than safe generation, operators disconnect districts in rotation to keep the remaining system stable. A national collapse is different. Generation and consumption fall out of balance. The grid's frequency changes, and protective equipment disconnects generators and lines before they are damaged. Those protections can save individual machines while accelerating a cascade across a system with almost no spare capacity. Restarting the grid means rebuilding small electrical islands and reconnecting them carefully. One mistake can collapse the system again, so a few illuminated blocks may be the beginning of recovery, not proof that recovery is complete. That vulnerability is modern, but its foundations are historical. Before the 1959 revolution, electricity access was sharply divided between cities and the countryside. After nationalizing the utility system, the revolutionary government greatly expanded service across the island. Rural electrification became part of a much larger promise. Education, healthcare, housing, and essential services would not be reserved for the wealthy. Electricity also became inseparable from the legitimacy of the new state. As more homes connected to the grid, Cuba's power system grew inside a protected economic world. The Soviet Union and other socialist countries supplied oil, machinery, credit, and markets for Cuban exports on favorable terms. Large thermoelectric stations and a national transmission network made sense when fuel and replacement equipment arrived through political alliances. The lights looked like evidence of Cuban independence, but the system behind them depended on an international relationship that the island did not control. Electricity became more than another service. It powered public hospitals, refrigerated medicine, moved water, supported schools, and made industrial employment possible. The state kept household prices heavily subsidized, strengthening the idea that power belonged to the social contract. That is why today's blackouts carry a meaning larger than inconvenience. Each outage interrupts ordinary life, but it also exposes the distance between one of the revolution's central promises and what the state can now deliver. Then the country that underwrote that system disappeared. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba lost an extraordinary share of its trade, credit, and fuel supply. The early 1990s became known as the special period in time of peace. Factories slowed or stopped. Public transportation contracted. Food became scarce. Bicycles, improvised buses, urban agriculture, and long-rotating blackouts became symbols of national survival. Older Cubans remember cooking whenever electricity appeared and sleeping outside when powerless apartments became unbearable. Cuba eventually found a new lifeline. Under Hugo Chavez, Venezuela sent oil on favorable terms while Cuba provided professional services, notably by sending medical personnel. Tourism brought foreign currency, and the island regained a degree of stability. Yet the replacement of Soviet support with Venezuelan support did not remove the central dependency. It changed the supplier. When Venezuelan production declined and shipments became less reliable, Cuba once again discovered that the security of its electricity system rested partly on decisions made somewhere else. The grid itself had already sent warnings. During the early 2000s, breakdowns at large plants produced severe power shortages. In 2005 and 2006, the government launched what it called an energy revolution. Millions of inefficient bulbs and household appliances were replaced. Smaller diesel and fuel, oil generators were installed around the country. Distributed generation could keep local areas alive when a major transmission line failed, and it reduced the dependence on a handful of giant stations. For the crisis of that period, this was not an irrational solution. Smaller units could be deployed more quickly than new power stations and could help hospitals, factories, and provinces operate during emergencies. But decentralizing the machines did not decentralize the fuel. Thousands of engines still required diesel, fuel oil, lubricants, filters, imported components, and regular servicing. A bridge through one crisis became a permanent layer of the national system, and the cost of keeping it ready continued to grow. Meanwhile, Cuba's largest oil-fired thermoelectric units grew older. Most of the country's thermoelectric plants have operated for more than 30 years, and some individual units date back 5 or 6 decades. The Antonio Guterres plant in Matanzas, the country's largest single generating unit, began operating in 1988. Other stations contain units from different decades and designs. Some were built with Soviet or Eastern European technology, but the fleet is not one uniform Soviet machine. It is a collection of aging systems held together by repeated maintenance. Maintenance becomes harder when a country lacks foreign currency. A planned shutdown requires replacement parts, specialist labor, and enough generation elsewhere to cover the missing unit. Cuba often has none of those in comfortable supply. Taking a plant offline for preventive work can deepen the immediate blackout. So repairs are delayed until failure forces the decision. Engineers may extend equipment life with extraordinary ingenuity, but improvisation cannot substitute for factory-grade components or years of capital investment. Cuba's domestic crude adds another complication. The island does produce oil, but much of it is heavy and sulfur-rich. It can be burned in power stations designed or adapted for it, but it is hard on boilers and increases maintenance demands. Domestic production also does not cover national needs. In 2026, the Associated Press reported that Cuba produced roughly 40% of the fuel it required. The exact share changes, but the larger fact does not imported oil and refined products remain essential. For years, much of that imported supply came from Venezuela, with additional shipments from Mexico and Russia. Those flows had already weakened before the sharpest phase of the current crisis. Cuba's problem was never simply finding a seller on a map. It needed credit, payment channels, insurance, suitable ships, port operations, and suppliers willing to wait for money from a country with very little hard currency. A barrel of oil can exist on the world market and still be economically unreachable. The shortage of foreign currency reaches far beyond fuel. Tourism collapsed during the pandemic, never returned to its 2019 level, and weakened again in 2025 and 2026. A troubled currency reform contributed to inflation and confusion. Domestic production weakened, imports became harder to finance, and mass emigration reduced the available workforce. When an electrical system loses money, its decline begins before a power plant visibly breaks. Spare parts inventories shrink. Maintenance intervals stretch. Fuel reserves fall. Staff are left to keep an increasingly complex system running with fewer resources. Each missing resource makes the next failure more likely and the recovery more expensive. From October 2024 through July 2026, plant failures, substation faults, hurricanes, and failed restorations became so frequent that nationwide collapse stopped feeling exceptional. The Antonio Guterres plant triggered major failures in October and December 2024, while Hurricane Rafael brought another national outage between them. Countrywide collapses followed on the 14th of March and the 10th of September 2025. A partial collapse on the 4th of March 2026 affected roughly two-thirds of the island, but was not nationwide. Full national failures followed on the 16th of March and the 21st of March. Then 3 more arrived in little more than a week in July. Different reports count partial failures and failed restorations differently, but the pattern is clear. The immediate pressure in 2026 came from fuel. On the 29th of January, President Donald Trump signed Executive Order 14,380, which took effect on the 30th of January. The order authorized but did not automatically impose additional tariffs on goods imported from any country found to have directly or indirectly supplied oil to Cuba. It was not a naval blockade, and it did not directly sanction every shipowner, insurer, or bank. Its deterrent power came from the possibility that an oil-supplying country's wider exports could face penalties in the much larger U.S. market. Havana described the policy as an energy blockade and blamed it for deepening a humanitarian emergency. United Nations officials separately warned that the fuel shortage was disrupting water, food, healthcare, and sanitation. The Trump administration instead framed Cuba's shortages as consequences of communist rule and decades of mismanagement. The evidence supports a narrower conclusion. Executive Order 14,380 did not create Cuba's aging plants or its earlier blackouts, but independent reporting and United Nations warnings indicate that it intensified an already severe fuel squeeze. External pressure struck a weak grid, and the weak grid multiplied the pressure. The crisis cannot be reduced to sanctions or domestic failure alone. The long-standing U.S. embargo complicates finance, shipping, and equipment purchases. Analysts and critics also point to Cuba's investment choices: centralized administration, weak productivity, and limited transparency as factors that made the system less resilient. Falling shipments from allies, the pandemic, storms, inflation, tourism losses, and emigration added further strain. The result can be seen in the daily forecast of the Cuban Electric Union. Installed capacity on paper may exceed national demand, but much of it is unavailable because a unit is broken, under maintenance, or without fuel. On the 20th of July, UNE forecasts 1,120 megawatts available against peak demand of 3,200, a deficit of 2,080 megawatts, with 2,110 megawatts of load expected to be affected. The expected shortfall was larger than the available supply. In a system with almost no reserve, even a generator that works perfectly can become too important to lose. For most families, the refrigerator is the most unforgiving clock. Food is already expensive and difficult to find. Meat, milk, medicine, or a prepared meal cannot always be replaced after a long cut. People cook everything before it spoils, move food to a neighbor with a battery, or open the refrigerator as little as possible. A nationwide collapse may last hours, but its cost remains in an empty shelf days later. Electricity is rationed by the utility. Loss is rationed by household income. The taps begin to slow. Much of Cuba's urban water system depends on electric pumps that lift water through aging networks and into rooftop tanks. When the power is absent, pumps stop. When diesel is scarce, water trucks cannot fill the gap. In late May 2026, Cuban authorities said that about 2.7 million people were experiencing daily water shortages and that the water system had only 37% of the fuel it required. Residents stored water whenever service returned because the next electrical cut could become the next dry day. Inside hospitals, electricity is treated as essential, but protected does not mean invulnerable. Critical facilities may have priority circuits and backup generators. Those generators need fuel, water systems, sterilization equipment, laboratories, refrigeration, ambulances, and the transport used by staff and patients all rely on the same strained supply chain. By early June 2026, the United Nations said more than 100,000 surgeries had been postponed. That figure cannot be blamed on electricity alone, but energy scarcity was tightening every other shortage around the medical system. Public transport reveals the same chain buses, trains, farm machinery, and repair vehicles all need fuel, while electric vehicles still need dependable charging. Workers may spend hours finding a ride, reach a workplace that has no power, and return home after electricity has already disappeared there. Food needs trucks and refrigeration to reach cities. Airlines need aviation fuel. In July, officials and international reporting described reduced working hours, widespread transport disruption, and flight cancellations. The crisis consumed time even when nothing dramatic appeared to happen. Communication also becomes uncertain. Mobile towers have backup systems, but batteries discharge and generators run out of fuel. Home routers stop immediately unless a family has its own battery. During nationwide blackouts, residents have gathered in open public spaces searching for a stronger signal and cooler air. A phone may contain money, family contacts, news, and access to work. Yet it becomes useful only as long as it can be charged and connected. The digital world rests on the same physical grid as the water pump. Heat turns every shortage into exhaustion. Concrete apartments absorb sunlight during the day and release it after dark. Without fans, sleep becomes difficult. Families move toward windows, balconies, sidewalks, and rooftops. Mosquitoes, noise, and anxiety replace rest. A person can endure one hot night as an inconvenience. Repeated nights change concentration, school attendance, work, health, and tempers. For the healthy, a blackout is draining. For infants, elderly people, and patients whose equipment depends on electricity, it can become dangerous. These pressures have contributed to public anger. Electricity and food shortages helped ignite the historic demonstrations of July 2021. Later outages produced smaller protests in several cities and neighborhoods. During parts of the 2026 crisis, residents banged pots, honked horns, or demanded the return of power. These incidents did not amount to a continuous nationwide uprising, and hardship does not automatically produce political change. They did show how an engineering failure can become a crisis of trust. When people strike empty pots in the dark, they are asking for electricity and an explanation. At first glance, solar energy appears to be the obvious escape. Cuba receives abundant sunlight, and unlike imported oil, no foreign government can stop the sun from reaching the island. With Chinese support, Cuba began a program for 92 solar parks intended to add more than 2,000 megawatts. By May 2026, Cuban officials said installed solar capacity had passed 1,300 megawatts. On bright days, solar farms could briefly supply more than 900 megawatts and sharply reduce the daytime deficit. This was not an imaginary achievement. But a megawatt of solar capacity is not a megawatt available through every hour of the night. Output falls with clouds and disappears after sunset when household demand remains high. Solar panels also do not automatically provide the independent startup power, voltage control, and frequency support needed to rebuild a collapsed grid. In fact, Cuban officials have acknowledged that a weak network sometimes forces operators to limit solar production even when the sun is available. The country can generate new electricity faster than it can modernize every line and control system needed to use it. Storage is therefore the missing bridge between Cuba's bright days and dark evenings. The government announced battery projects with a combined power rating of 200 megawatts and began commissioning small solar facilities with storage in 2026. That is a meaningful beginning, but a battery's power rating does not reveal how long it can supply that power. Without knowing their energy capacity in megawatt-hours, no one can honestly say how long the planned batteries could support the grid. The most valuable use of storage may not be keeping every home on at once. Hospitals, water pumps, telecommunications sites, pharmacies, and neighborhood cooling or charging centers could operate as protected microgrids. Batteries could smooth solar output and give operators the few critical minutes needed to prevent a cascade. Distributed systems could keep essential services alive while the national network is repaired. This would not eliminate the need for large generation and transmission investment, but it could make a national failure less immediately destructive. Solar power also creates a difficult social question. If national solar farms feed an unreliable grid, while wealthy households buy private batteries, renewable energy may reduce the overall shortage and deepen visible inequality at the same time. Families with dollars can store sunlight. Families without dollars receive whatever reaches the public line. A clean energy transition is not automatically a fair energy transition. Cuba must decide whether resilience will be sold household by household or built into services that everyone can use. The government has begun to acknowledge that the state cannot solve every shortage alone. Measures approved by Parliament in June took effect on the 29th of July, 2026, easing restrictions on private imports and resale and loosening rules for foreign participation in oil extraction. In a separate policy package presented in June, officials proposed solar charging and photovoltaic plus storage systems that could allow some service stations to operate independently of the national grid. These were significant changes for a government that had long controlled most large economic activity. They were also emergency measures, not proof that the emergency had ended. Investment requires more than permission. A company considering a power project needs confidence that it can import equipment, receive payment, exchange currency, enforce a contract, and operate under stable rules. Cuba needs capital precisely because its crisis makes capital cautious. The state can open a door, but damaged infrastructure, international sanctions, political uncertainty, and weak domestic demand still stand behind it. The same circular problem affects fuel. The country needs energy to revive production, but it needs productive income to buy energy. There is no single machine that can rescue the island. Emergency oil shipments can reduce blackouts for days or weeks, but they preserve dependence on the next tanker. Repairing old thermal units can recover hundreds of megawatts, but the machines will continue to age. Solar farms can transform daytime generation, but they need storage, transmission, and controls. Broader economic reform could create foreign currency, while improved external relations could unlock equipment and finance. Each solution works on a different part of the crisis, and each arrives on a different timetable. The likely future is therefore less dramatic than either collapse or salvation. Cuba may continue operating old oil-fired plants while adding solar batteries and smaller protected networks. Fuel will remain necessary for years. Planned blackouts may continue even if nationwide collapses become less common. Some provinces and households will improve sooner than others. The system that emerges may be more decentralized in technology while remaining centralized in political control. It will be rebuilt through compromises, not one revolutionary announcement. By late July, Cuba had repeatedly escaped complete darkness without escaping the conditions that produced it. Restoration had become a cycle: reconnect the grid, ration the available power, repair the next failed unit, and wait for another breakdown. The emergency no longer consisted of isolated blackouts. It had become the normal operation of the system. The state has asked Cubans for endurance for decades. Engineers have kept machinery alive beyond the point when replacement would be normal. Families have learned routines that turn uncertainty into survival. Solar parks are changing the shape of daytime electricity faster than many outside observers realize. These are genuine forms of resilience. But resilience can become a flattering word for being forced to tolerate what should have been repaired. A society cannot improvise indefinitely around the failure of its basic systems. When power finally returns to an apartment, the change is immediate. A fan begins to turn. A pump sends water toward the roof. Phone chargers appear in every outlet. The refrigerator starts the long process of becoming cold again for a few minutes. Ordinary life resumes, yet the return of electricity is not the same as trust. The crisis is measured by whether people can rely on the grid long enough to plan a life. Cuba once made electrification a symbol of national progress and social equality. Today, the hours of darkness measure the distance between that promise and lived reality. The island's future will not be decided only in Washington, Havana, Beijing, Caracas, or a power plant control room. It will also be decided in the quiet moment when a family hears the fan begin to move, feels the first current of air, and wonders how long it will keep turning.